Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The American Plague, the untold story of yellow fever, the epidemic that shaped our history, by Molly Caldwell Crosby, narrated by Paul Woodson. Nothing is an accident. Fever grows in the secret places of our hearts, planted there when one of us decided to sell one of us to another. John Edgar Wideman, Fever. Prologue. A house boarded shut. The flies had been swarming around the house for days. As he walked the exterior, he tried to peer into the boarded windows, where flies crawled through starbursts of broken glass. Shielding his eyes with cupped hands, he could not see anything through the black splinters of darkness but a gray, dim light. He had no name, at least not one that survived in the family records. He was an old slave who continued to live with the Angevine family as a servant long after he had been legally freed. The family owned a 4,000-acre farm outside of Grenada, Mississippi, where Mrs. Angevine had been born and raised before marrying a New York attorney and moving to Memphis. A graduate of Harvard Law, Mr. Angevine worked in the Memphis offices of Harris, McKissick, and Turley. When the Civil War broke out, he fought for the South against his brothers fighting for the North. The family left Memphis and boarded themselves inside the plantation house where the 1878 yellow fever epidemic struck. The measure may have seemed drastic to others, but Mr. Angevine understood the toll of yellow fever better than most. His wife had died of the fever the previous summer. As far as the servant could see, the front door was locked, and the flies seemed to have the only access to the house. He pried open the shutters and broke the glass, letting loose a plume of repugnant air. In the stale, dark rooms he saw the corpses of the Angevine family, many in advanced stages of decomposition. Even in the darkness he could see their yellow skin, the color of unpolished brass. Mary Louisa, the eldest, had been the first to go, and 5 others had followed. Mr. Angevine lay dead among his children. No one can really imagine those final days in the fever-ridden house. The fever attacked each person in the Angevine family, one after the other, until none were well enough to help the others. It hit suddenly in the form of a piercing headache and painful sensitivity to light, like looking into a white sun. At that point, the patient could still hope that it was not yellow fever, maybe just a headache from the heat. But the pain worsened, crippling movement and burning the skin. The fever rose to 104, maybe 105 degrees, and bones felt as though they had been cracked. The kidneys stopped functioning, poisoning the body. Abdominal cramps began in the final days of illness as the patient vomited black blood brought on by internal hemorrhaging. The victim became a palette of hideous color. Red blood ran from the gums, eyes, and nose. The tongue swelled, turning purple. Black vomit roiled, and the skin grew a deep gold, the whites of the eyes turning brilliant yellow. The servant climbed through the window and made his way through the rooms where other servants and guests had died. Finally, he found a body not yet rotting. It was the youngest daughter, 9-year-old Lena. He knelt down, brushing away flies and maggots. Lifting her weightless frame, he carried her out of the family mansion that had now become a tomb into the fresh air. He placed her body in a nearby house, resting a piece of raw bacon across her lips, and watched as Lena began to suck on the first bite of food she had had in days. It was then that Lena, more dead than alive, began to make her way back. In the coming weeks she would recover and tell of the horrors trapped inside of the house. Men from the countryside came into the city, robbing the dead and stepping over the bodies of the dying. My own father, while ill with the fever, was choked, robbed, and left alone to die. I was too ill to even cry out for help, but witnessed the entire affair. With no surviving family, Lena went to live with her grandparents in Memphis to attend St. Mary's School. After graduation, and against the wishes of her grandparents, she enrolled in a nursing school at the Maury and Mitchell Infirmary, where she worked under the tutelage of Dr. Robert Wood Mitchell. The remainder of Lena Angevine's time in the South was a patchwork of nursing, ambition, and marriage to a St. Louis man by the name of E.C. Warner. Warner, whose name Lena Angevine would take from that point forward, died of a heart attack just 4 months after the marriage. At least that was the generally accepted story. Family rumors also alluded to a divorce. As it was far better to be a widow than a divorcee in the 1890s, Lena Warner would naturally opt for a dead husband over an estranged one. Lena Angevine Warner's experience with yellow fever would continue to sear her, and in 1898, with the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, she answered an ad in the newspaper. The Surgeon General of the United States Army was looking for nurses immune to yellow fever. Warner would receive $50 per month, and in 1900 she was stationed in Cuba as chief nurse under a doctor of some distinction, Major Walter Reed. Part 1. The American Plague. Plague. A widespread affliction or calamity, especially one seen as divine retribution. The American Heritage Dictionary. The rain came in West Africa. A massive wind blew in from the Atlantic coast, bringing the deluge of water known as the Southwest Monsoon. It swelled the Niger and Benue rivers. It spilled into the braided streams of the Niger Delta. It filled the floodplains and swamplands of southeastern Nigeria. It purpled the sky and saturated the country. Towering oil palms dripped water from their feathered branches, and the brush-marked trunks of rubber trees were streaked with rain. The broad brush-topped cocoa trees moistened, and the forests of Nigeria grew heavy and humid. Water is nourishing, and it enriched the plant life emerging from West Africa's dry season. It also nourished something else, dry, oval-shaped eggs, clinging to life inside the hollows of trees. Once the rain fell, those eggs grew, and soon mosquitoes hatched. In the natural world, a string of events had been set into motion. The rains falling in Africa did not deter men from entering the forest and felling trees for timber. As the trees fell, their canopy of dense green fell with them, often bringing a swarm of gnats and mosquitoes with it. Some of those mosquitoes would bite. The native Africans who worked the forests noticed an eerie silence in the trees, usually alive with the piercing sound of birds, the hum of insects, and the calls of monkeys. Tree canopies in some areas were still, a haunting contrast to the living, breathing rainforest, a sign that something was not right in the ecosystem. The monkeys had grown ill, their shrill chatter quieted. Unknown to the men, the rainforest, teeming with smells, sounds, color, and life, was also home to something much smaller, microscopic, a tiny, thriving life form. No one knows for sure how the yellow fever virus first came into existence. No records of it in early history exist, nor is it among the biblical plagues. But then how does any new life emerge? There is a creation and a birth, and eventually a discovery in the dark forests of Africa. A virus is one of the smallest beings in evolution's survival of the fittest, mutating and coalescing in order to thrive, its ultimate goal being epidemic. Viruses affect nearly every life form on Earth, from flora to fauna. But a virus in its own right is not actually alive. It only becomes alive by possessing something living. The virus seeks out a healthy cell, overtakes it, impregnating it, forcing the body's cells to produce thousands of the new offspring. This rapacious battle will eventually allow the virus, something as small as 1/10,000th of a millimeter, to conquer something the size of a human. It is uncertain whether viruses evolved from a single cell, becoming more complex, or whether they devolved into something simpler, more efficient, gracefully infectious. Either way, a virus is an evolutionary masterpiece, since it does not have the ability to have sex or reproduce on its own. It must constantly change, adapting to other life forms, from something as small as bacteria to something as large as mammals. Taking it a step further, once the virus has mastered something like a mosquito in the case of yellow fever or a bird in the case of influenza, it may spread to other species. There it adapts again and again until there is a seamless transition between certain species, perhaps a monkey to a mosquito to a man. Once inside the bloodstream, a virus is programmed with elegantly simple genetic material, its DNA or RNA, to produce certain symptoms that will spread it further. In the common cold, sneezing and a runny nose spread the virus. In smallpox, open sores on the skin act as the vehicle for infection. With influenza, coughing expels the virus into the air. In the case of HIV, the virus uses one of the most basic functions in human life, reproduction, to spread through the population of men, women, and children. Yellow fever is what is known as a flavivirus, a group of viruses spread by mosquitoes that includes West Nile, dengue, and Japanese encephalitis. As a virus, yellow fever is not one of the stronger ones. It cannot live outside of the body for more than a few hours. It does not spread through the air or by touch. It does not mutate as easily as some viruses. In fact, its most telling symptom, fever, is really just the body's own attempt to kill the virus. What makes yellow fever unique is its choice of vector. What the virus lacks in evolutionary prowess, the mosquito makes up for. In the African rainforest, mosquitoes carry the virus, this finely evolved life form looking to conquer. The mosquito feeds off of the monkeys in the tree canopy, and a small epidemic erupts, foreshadowing the larger one to follow. Of course, none of this would be known until well into the 20th century. For the Africans and Europeans, and later for the Americans, a virus would remain an invisible, unknown entity. No one would even know how yellow fever spread from one person to the next until 1900. As the men made their way back to the Niger Delta and the coast of West Africa, where the timber would be sold for ships carrying palm oil, ivory, salt, gold, and slaves, they might run a mild fever or feel lethargic, but it was nothing compared to what the white Europeans would feel in the coming weeks. Through this cycle of men entering the forests, mosquitoes biting men and the virus spreading among small tribal villages, most native Africans had encountered the yellow fever virus at one time or another. They acquired immunity to it, and the virus began to run out of the kindling that kept the flames of fever alive. When white Europeans landed on the coast of West Africa, it was like a fresh burst of oxygen in a waning fire. The Nigerian coast had been booming with the slave trade since the 15th century, providing the Middle Passage across the Atlantic with 30% of its human exports. As the ships of the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English pitched in the ocean swells along the coast, they waited for the cargo making its way from the interior down the river delta to the coast. The port towns were filled with the smells of Africa, sweet oil from the palms, spices, yams, and dates sold at local markets. There was fire smoke, and the poignant scent of rainwater mixed with human sweat, where the next shipment of slaves sat chained to one another in thatched sheds, waiting to board the ship. Fearful of tropical diseases, the Europeans might even taste the sweat of slaves to try to determine if he or she carried disease. The smells would worsen in the next few months at sea, when hot air, sweat, and human excrement would be trapped beneath deck with the slaves. When the ships encountered squalls and the sea and sky would join, the tumbling ship would induce vomit to add to the amalgam of human smells. As the ship traversed the waters of the Atlantic, the virus made its way through the bloodstream of the passengers as succinctly as it had made its way through the rivers of West Africa to the coast. In the blood, yellow fever looks something like a fuzzy snowflake, but it is actually round, with 20 smooth sides that protect the virus's single strand of RNA at the center. The coating of the virus is made up of proteins, and human cells are attracted to those proteins. The virus doesn't need to look for healthy cells. They look for it. Once the two make contact in the bloodstream, a process with a technical name known as receptor-mediated endocytosis begins, sort of a molecular Trojan horse. The healthy cell eventually enfolds the virus, taking it in and closing the door behind it. Once inside, the virus hijacks the cell and its basic machinery, using the cell's internal makeup to replicate the viral proteins and RNA until the new particles burst through the cell. A body that was once filled with healthy cells is now filling up with cells carrying the yellow fever virus. That is why a virus cannot be treated by antibiotics. Human cells give it refuge, and anything that could destroy the virus might also destroy the cell. Soon, the filth, lack of nutrition, dehydration, and rapid-fire spread of disease turned the transatlantic journey into a death voyage, with bodies being tossed overboard in the wake of the ship. In fact, slave ships were often trailed by sharks, which quickly learned that the vessels served as a source of food. It was through this journey from the interior of West Africa, down the Niger and Benue rivers to the coast, onto ships and into the blood of Europeans, that yellow fever first made its way from the Old World to the New One. Yellow fever, more than any other disease, would seem conjured by God and divinely directed. When the slave trade first began, every European country that profited from the purchase and sale of Africans would soon see a yellow fever epidemic. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal. Though Asia had the ideal climate and the right mosquito, it has never had an epidemic of yellow fever. It also never participated in the African slave trade. As the European powers crossed the Atlantic to establish West Indian colonies, which quickly became horrific holding pens for slaves, yellow fever settled its roots in the Western Hemisphere and proliferated. The first epidemic on this side of the world occurred in 1648. After that, the slave trade increased fivefold in the West Indies. And by 1702, as the trade of flesh spread to North America, yellow fever blossomed on the continent. From 1700 to 1750, the slave population in America doubled and then doubled again. As each slave ship arrived into the ports of the New World, bringing over 10 million slaves to this hemisphere, yellow fever made a giant evolutionary leap. It adapted. It spread. As one historian put it, when the disease invaded the Atlantic and Gulf states, it struck with a force more powerful than the one which bombed Pearl Harbor more than 2 centuries later. Yellow fever became the most dreaded disease in North America for 200 years. It did not kill in numbers as high as some of its contemporaries like cholera or smallpox, and it was not contagious. Yet it created a panic and fear few other diseases, ancient or contemporary, can elicit. During its tenure in this country, yellow fever would inflict 500,000 casualties and 100,000 deaths. The fever would stretch the length of North America, afflicting Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, Maryland, Illinois, Missouri, Ohio, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Florida, and Texas. The U.S. capital would move from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., after a devastating yellow fever epidemic in 1793. Alexander Hamilton suffered the fever, while George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson fled the city. The United States government was paralyzed. In New York, Greenwich Village would become known as the Village because it was the safe haven outside of the city during yellow fever epidemics. Napoleon would abandon his conquests in North America after losing 23,000 of his troops to yellow fever in the colony of Haiti. He made a hasty and fearful retreat from this pestilent hemisphere, selling his large Louisiana holdings for cheap to Thomas Jefferson. During the Civil War, yellow fever would serve as one of this country's first forms of biological warfare, and the Spanish-American War, at the close of the 19th century, would be fought more against this fever than against the Spanish. For the first century of its siege in the United States, yellow fever marked for destruction the heavily populated northern port cities of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Then, in 1807, the Atlantic slave trade was abolished, and the fever suddenly retreated from the north. By 1850, no other epidemics of yellow fever would occur in those major cities. As the North weaned itself from the slave trade, its southern counterpart absorbed the slave labor and the accompanying yellow fever. In the South, where slavery became deeply entrenched, yellow fever found its lifeblood. The 1878 yellow fever epidemic, the worst in history, started with the rains in West Africa. February, the wet season arrived. The mosquitoes hatched. The monkeys grew ill. The loggers stared up at the silent tree canopy. This time the ships moored off the coast would not carry slaves across the Atlantic. They would carry ivory, gold, copper, salt, and mosquitoes. But this year would be different for two reasons. Nature had afforded the virus with the perfect environment. An El Niño cycle turned the American South that winter into a tropical region with warm temperatures and rainfall 150% above normal. Insects, usually deterred by the winter freeze, proliferated. The significance of the weather phenomenon meant nothing to 19th-century observers, but 100 years later scientists would link El Niño to most major outbreaks of yellow fever. As Southerners cut hyacinth blooms in January and waded through waterlogged streets, they complained about the number of mosquitoes beginning to swarm. American progress was the virus's other ally. A great influx of immigrants, Irish, German, Eastern European, had been migrating south since the Civil War. Just like the white Europeans descending upon Nigeria and other parts of West Africa, they served as fuel for a fever fire, a fresh source of non-immune blood for the virus. Transportation had paved the way for these immigrants. Trains connected every corner of America for the first time, east to west, north to south, and paddle boats and steamers snaked their way north from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River. At the center of this web sat a city 400 miles inland from the Gulf, ready to take its place as one of the largest, most successful cities in the South. Memphis, Tennessee, was poised for greatness in 1878. By the end of that year, it would suffer losses greater than the Chicago fire, San Francisco earthquake, and Johnstown flood combined. The devastation to the Mississippi Valley would cost over $350 million by today's standards. And the U.S. government would create the National Board of Health, which would report, "To no other great nation of the earth is yellow fever so calamitous as to the United States of America." As the southwest monsoon pelted the Niger Delta in February 1878, hatching mosquito eggs and giving birth to a virus, people on the other side of the world could not have known what awaited them. In Memphis, Tennessee, their attention was turned not toward disease or health, but just the opposite, a carnival. Part 2. Memphis, 1878. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel. Edgar Allan Poe, The Mask of the Red Death. Chapter 1. Carnival. The bell sounded. A servant wearing a white jacket with all the trimmings of formality stood outside the door, a gilded envelope in his gloved hand. It was the most coveted invitation of the year. The envelope was exquisite, large and square, with golden calligraphy. Inside it took the shape of a scroll on powder-blue parchment, with a regal crown framing the top where Carnival, Memphis Mardi Gras was engraved. Fanning out of an Egyptian pyramid, the secret order of the Memphi and Ulks invited you and your household to attend his pageants March 4th and 5th, 1878. Over 10,000 people would answer this invitation to Memphis, including, one year, the President of the United States. As many as 40,000 revelers would stand shoulder to shoulder along the downtown streets of Memphis. Harper's would reserve front-page coverage, sending their best illustrator. The glitter and glamour of the event was known across the country, and it was widely whispered that New Orleans had sent scouts to Memphis to study the parade. And so began Carnival, Memphis had been chosen as a bluff city, literally poised on the precipice of the American South and an immense new frontier. The only thing separating the two was the treacherous Mississippi River, a huge gash in the American landscape. Murky, ochre-colored, and unpredictable, the river pushed against levees, dividing the river town from the dense forests and willow thickets of Arkansas. It was the last stop for the likes of David Crockett and Sam Houston making their way to Texas, a place for flatboats to purchase firearms before heading west, and it was the point of entry back into the civilized world of the Old South. But it wasn't just the topography that gave Memphis a startling sense of contrast. It was the people. All classes of society, all colors of skin, all manner of accents migrated to a fault line carved between the past and the future, the Old South and the new frontier. As the latticework of American transportation and expansion spread westward in the 1850s, Memphis remained at the crossroads. Steamboats joined the city to a massive trade line between the Gulf of Mexico through the Ohio Valley, and railroads connected it to the burgeoning ports of Charleston and New Orleans. Surrounded by rural states and plantations, Memphis became a hub, the largest inland cotton market at its peak, handling 360,000 bales of cotton per year. As the bluff city sloped toward the Mississippi River, levees and thoroughfares piled high with crates of tufted white, Memphis looked like a town literally built upon cotton. But cotton was not the only business booming. At the center of a vast web of plantations, railroad lines, and port towns, Memphis profited from the slave market as well. The Bolton, Dickens and Company held what could only be called yard sales for slaves, while Hill, Bird and Sons and Nathan Bedford Forrest opened slave showrooms on Adams Street. Said to have kept his business fair and his slave pens clean, Forrest prospered as one of the South's largest slave traders, selling up to 1,000 slaves per year. Forrest, a vehement Confederate, took up arms during the Civil War and, in spite of near illiteracy, rose in rank to become one of the greatest military tacticians in American history. His surprise attacks on Northern troops in Memphis would later inspire the German Blitzkrieg. Long after the Civil War, Forrest's name would live in infamy for founding the Ku Klux Klan. Even as Northern troops marched through Memphis in the 1860s, they recognized it as a center for trade and transportation, contraband or otherwise. It was spared Sherman's flames, and a strange coexistence emerged between the occupying army and its Confederate residents. The North looked the other way as illegal Southern shipments slipped through Northern quarantine. As a result, despite 4 years of Civil War, Memphis business and shipping never ceased, and a number of those Northern troops never left. The Civil War put an end to slavery once and for all, but the slave trade would have a lasting legacy not yet realized. By 1870, Memphis's population of 40,000 was almost double that of Nashville and Atlanta, ranking it second only to New Orleans as the largest city in the South. As its population grew, so did its diversity. It was a city built upon clashes, of river against land, and people against people. Despite the relative good fortune in Memphis, the country lagged under national debt in the 1870s. The Panic of 1873 ushered in an economic depression the likes of which had never been seen before, and the South suffered most of all. The war had destroyed the vast farmlands and plantations that carried the financial success of the entire region. Even if Memphis was equipped and ready to ship cotton north, none was arriving from the South. As jobs grew scarce on farms and in small towns, poor families flocked to nearby cities, and the newly termed tramps moved freely along the railroads. Soon Memphis swelled with the underclasses. A freedmen's camp established during Northern occupation propelled the black population in Memphis from 3,000 to over 15,000, nearly 40% of the city's total makeup. Blacks constituted only one faction of a largely disparate and unhappy population. Irish and German immigrants struggled to free themselves from the mire of post-war poverty and racial politics. Yanks continued to live in the South to facilitate Reconstruction, and the upper echelons, white aristocrats of a bygone era, were depressed by a river town less Southern and far more Western, full of filth, violence, and rough river folk. City legislators spent...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?